So you know how everyone says that in order to get great bread, you need to use a starter that's at its peak? Well, I have just made this loaf of bread with a sourdough discard starter that was last fed 6 days ago. So I don't think I believe that rule anymore. Ever since I have done my no stretch and folds experiment, I've been wondering what are the other parts of the whole sourdough bread making process that we have made into unnecessarily strict rules, and everyone seems to think that those things are absolutely essential to get a good loaf of bread. And the state of the sourdough starter seemed like a place where a lot of the overcomplication was happening. I have already done one video, you can check that out up there, where I have used a 24-hour old starter and the bread turned out really great, and I thought there needs to be more experimenting going on, and so this time I made 2 loaves of bread with 2 discard starters, one that was 3 days old and another one that was 6 days old, and you've just seen the result. And this is the result of that 3-day-old starter. This is the 6-day one, 3-day one. Pretty cool, right? So in this video, I'll walk you through the entire experiment, how I did this, what were the proportions and everything, measurements that I've used. And then at the end of the video, I'm also cut into those breads that still need to cool down a little bit, and we'll see if there is any difference on the inside and in terms of the taste of the breads. I unfortunately forgot to film the feeding of the starters, so you will just have to believe me that this is what happened. But so what I did is I took my jar of my starter from the fridge. I have fed that starter. And by the way, the feeding ratio, I don't really measure. I usually do a little bit more of the flour than water, so my starter is always a little bit thicker than the liquidy kind that you see more often. So I've let it rise to its peak at room temperature. When that was done, which took a couple hours, and then it started decreasing again, I took about 170 grams out of that into a separate jar, which I've then labeled with the date. So the older one that I was doing, I was feeding on the 24th of March, and I've put that jar into the back of my fridge. And then the rest of the starter, I still had a little bit left in my regular jar, I put in the fridge as well. I took it out again a couple days later on the 27th of March, and I fed that again, approximately the same proportions or the same amount of flour and water, although it is true that I did not measure, and let it again come to its peak at room temperature, and then took again 170 grams out of that into a separate jar, labeled that, and put it back in the fridge. And then yesterday, which was the 30th of March, so 6 days later after that first feed and 3 days later after that second feed, I took both of the jars out, and you can see what they looked like in the jar. Not really all that many bubbles. I was surprised to see any though, and you will see later once I'm adding these starters into the dough that one of them looked like that there was a little bit of activity still going on, and I was really surprised to see that that was actually the older starter. So the one that I fed 6 days ago looked like it was more active than the one that I have fed more recently. So that was very surprising to me. And if you compare it to my bread results, at least what I can see now before cutting into it, it also looks like that the bread that I made with the older starter had just a little bit more of that oven spring than the other one. That was very intriguing to me, and I wonder if it was because I was feeding the starters maybe slightly different ratios. Again, I didn't measure how much I was feeding the starter, so it is possible that the older one had more flour, so technically more food for the starter to go through, so that might have been a little difference in the 2 starters. So I took both of those out from the fridge, and I mixed all of my dough ingredients. So everything everything else, all of the amounts of flour and water and salt and caraway seeds I was adding as well, they were exactly the same for both of these breads. The only difference was the age of the starter, which, by the way, if you want the exact recipe, you will find it in the description below. I'm doing a combination of all-purpose white flour and a little bit of whole wheat flour just to give it a little bit more taste, and then adding the salt and the caraway seeds, then adding water, then adding the starter. And I am mixing that first with a spatula and then with my hands as well. And I was trying to be quite careful about cleaning the spatula and all of the spoons to not like mix in any way the two starters and the two doughs. And then I'm doing just, I don't know if you can even call this shaping, but kind of this movement where I'm trying to make a little like ball out of the dough just to give it a little bit of a shape in the bowl. Both of the doughs were a little bit more sticky than what I'm used to, like as in compared to when I use a starter that's at its peak. And again, I'm guessing that that's because when the starter is more of a discard, it hasn't been recently fed, it becomes more liquidy. At least that's the case for my starter. Because I feed it a little bit more flour, it usually is a little bit denser, a little bit tougher if I'm using it at its peak versus when I'm using a discard like this, which has already like peaked down and just sort of liquidified more, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, and I'm not 100% sure if that's the cause for why the dough is a little bit more shaggy, a little bit more sticky. That's just my observation so far. But it's not like too difficult to work with or anything like that. It's just a little bit more sticky than what I'm used to. And so once I have combined both of these doughs, I have covered them up with some bowl covers in a plastic bag, and I've let them sit on the counter at room temperature for about 2 hours. This is probably a good place to pause and talk a little bit about why I think this should work, or how did I even come up with the idea that it should. So my hypothesis is that feeding the starter and adding the starter into the dough mixture are essentially the exact same thing. When you're feeding the starter, you're giving a little bit of your starter, a discard starter, you're giving it flour and water to feed it. And when you're mixing a starter, a discard starter, into the dough mixture, you're giving that discard starter flour and water. And so they seem like the same exact process. Like when you're feeding the starter is then eating through and fermenting the flour that you just gave it. And the exact same thing is happening when you're mixing the starter into your dough. And so my thinking was like, why should it be such a difference if you're doing first a one feed and then essentially doing a second feed with mixing the starter into all of the dough? Why not combine it into just one and having a discard starter and feeding it as part of the whole making the bread process and just mixing it right into the dough? What I also thought would be a difference or a factor in this is how long the dough is then fermenting. I thought that if I used a discard starter, it would take longer for the dough, the bread dough, to ferment and to rise a little bit than if I'm using the peak starter, thinking that, you know, the peak starter has like more activity to it. The process has already started. There is already a lot of fermentation happening, and therefore you can leave it on the counter for a lower period of time than if you're using a discard starter. Now, I'm talking about this a little bit more at the very end of the video, so watch that to hear how that hypothesis turned out. So this was my whole thinking behind it. Please keep in mind, I'm no scientist, no professional baker. I don't really understand what's happening in these processes. This is purely me using my common sense and what that's telling me. And now back to my counter fermentation. After those 2 hours, you can see that it doesn't look like there's all that much happening. Both of the doughs look very similar. You can see that with the bowl that had the newer starter in it, let's say, the dough made with the newer starter, it looks like there is more, like you can see a little bit more of the activity when I lower the camera down and you're seeing the bottom of the dough. You can see the bubbles and everything. But I feel like that's just because of the shape of the bowl. Like that bowl had a much more narrow bottom. And so the dough was like more squeezed and you could see that. Whereas the other one had like a bigger surface, and so the dough just sort of spread on the bottom and you couldn't really see it rising in the bowl. But when you look from, top down, they both looked exactly the same. So at that point, I took out my 2 Benetton baskets and I've shaped both of these doughs into the Benetton baskets in the same way. Again, one of them is the Benetton basket is slightly bigger, and that's the one, like I've used the bigger bowl together with the bigger basket, and that was the older starter. And then the more narrow bowl with the more narrow basket had the newer starter bread in it. Once they were in their baskets, I covered them back up into those plastic covers and I've put them in the fridge. And I was doing this around, I think like 5 p.m. So about 5 p.m. yesterday, I've put them in the fridge, and then this morning I started baking them around 9-ish, I would say. So they've had, 15 hours in the fridge? Am I doing the math right? I hope I am. Someone call me out in the comments if I'm not. So about 15 hours, about 15 hours in the fridge. And so then this morning, I turned my oven on at 250 degrees, that is Celsius. Since I live in the Czech Republic, that's Europe, so we use Celsius here. Someone, by the way, asked in the comments about me crinkling up the parchment paper. So I do that just to have the parchment paper lay flat. As you can see, if I don't do that, it just rolls up into, back into its rolled up shape. So that's just an easy trick to keep it flat. Once the oven was preheated to the 250, I scored the first bread. So that was the newer starter that was going in first. I did just a very simple cross score. It went into the oven for 20 minutes. At 20 minutes, I took the lid off of my Dutch oven and I did another 5 minutes at a slightly lower temperature of about 200 degrees Celsius. I took it out and it was a beautiful bread. And then I turned the oven back up to 250 degrees, let it heat up again, let it heat for a little bit, and I did the second bread in the exact same way, scored it, put it in for 20 minutes, and then 5 minutes at a lower temperature with the lid off. So just like in my other experiments, there is a slight difference with the whole process of baking because I'm using just this one oven. I have just one Dutch oven. Even if I had another one, I couldn't fit 2 in my oven at the same time. So I have to go one bread by another. And so I'm not really controlling the oven temperature and how long it's preheating. And, that is not super precise. But I'm hoping that that's not like a major difference in the whole experiment and that this is still a valid result. All right, so that is the whole experiment explained. And now let's cut into that bread and have a little taste. And here we have it. These are the 2 halves of the 2 breads. This one with the slightly bigger hole here is the 6-day-old starter. This is the 3-day-old starter. As you can see, not a huge difference. They are pretty squishy. Are they the most, the fluffiest breads you've ever seen? No, but I was not expecting that. I was hoping that I'm going to get a decent bread, which this definitely fills my definition of a really good bread. Also, I don't think that, at least in terms of looks, that this is either of them, that this is any different or that there is any big difference from what my normal bread looks like, which I make with the Peak starter. And in terms of the taste, I already had a bite out of both of those two. Definitely couldn't tell a difference between those two. And I also don't think that these are in any way different than what my normal bread tastes like. I would have to do a comparison of all three of them probably side by side. I didn't make my regular bread with the Peak starter, but just going off of the fact that right away I cannot tell a difference tells me that even if there is a difference, it's just so small that it just doesn't really matter all that much. I feel like maybe the texture is a little bit denser, but that just could be my biased opinion or just my very subjective opinion. Like I said, I don't really have the third bread side by side to make a direct comparison. So this could just be me not remembering what my actual bread tastes and looks like. So at the end of this experiment, I'm confident to say that for me, it does not matter if I'm using a starter that's at its peak or a starter that has been fed 3-6 days ago and it's essentially a discard starter once I'm mixing it into the dough. If there is any difference, it's so small for me that I can't really tell, and that's all that matters to me. I highly encourage you to do this experiment. Definitely let me know down in the comments what are your results. I'm really looking forward to that. And as a last part of this video, I wanted to also say one other thing, because I have done this experiment already one time before. So this is the second time that I'm doing this like old discard starter process. And so what I did the first time around when I was making this experiment, I was going into it with the hypothesis that because the starter is a discard, it's going to take it longer to ferment the dough, and therefore I should keep it on the counter at room temperature for a longer period of time. And so instead of doing 2 hours on the counter, which is what I did this time, I let it ferment for 4 hours. And you will see some of those shots here. If I recall correctly, the dough was definitely looking a little bit more bubbly and it has risen a little bit more. But then when I baked it the next day, so I then put it into the fridge for an overnight fridge ferment and then bake it the next morning, the breads did not come up as much as these ones did. I definitely felt like there was a bigger difference, especially with the older starter that I was using back then. Also, that one was 8 days old. So 8 days old compared to the 6-day-old one that I was using this time. And that to me seemed like a significant enough difference that I would probably not use that or not call it the same bread. But so then I was thinking, like, was this because I over fermented the bread? Was that the reason why they didn't, spring as much? And so in this experiment that you have just seen, that's why I kept the counter ferment period to 2 hours, which is the exact same time that I do for my normal bread that I use with the Peak starter. Maybe it was also the age of that other starter, that the 8 days was just a little bit too much. But then again, As you have seen here, it was the 6-day-old starter that seemed to have a slightly better result, slightly better oven spring than the 3-day one. So I don't think that was the case. I really think it was the essentially double amount of counter fermentation that I was doing at room temperature. So that hypothesis kind of was shattered with this second try. You don't need a longer fermentation when you're using a discard starter. Just try to do this with the regular timing, the regular process that you're normally using for your peak starter. And so that is everything for this experiment, but boy, do I have more questions and more kind of, wondering if this is really how it works when it comes to the whole sourdough process. Do you need to preheat your oven? How different is the process when you use different amounts of the starter? What about the different types of flour? What are some other things that you keep hearing from everywhere around that are not necessarily true or don't really have much of an impact on the whole sourdough making process? If you have questions like that or you're wondering about those things too, let me know down in the comments. I'm definitely looking for ideas on what else I could experiment with. I'm having lots of fun doing this. I hope you're having fun watching me go through all of these, and that more importantly, it is simplifying sourdough for you as well as much it is for me. And that will be all for me today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.